here for Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici's webinar about recent changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. We'll begin shortly, but I just want to give a moment for attendees to join us from the waiting room. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Ali Mayeda and I work for Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, and welcome to her webinar about recent changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. We'll get started in just a minute. The Congresswoman will share opening remarks, and then Mike Pierce, who's the Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center, will make a brief presentation. And then Suzanne and Mike look forward to taking your questions. More than 600 people signed up for today's webinar, and we are live streaming the webinar on the Congresswoman's YouTube channel. During the question portion, we will be using the Q&A function in Zoom. So if you would like to ask a question, please click on Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Let's give it just one more minute to see how we're doing on attendees, but I think everyone has joined. Great. Congresswoman, please go ahead.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Ali. And thank you everyone for being here. Thanks to my staff in Oregon and in Washington, D.C. for helping to put this together. I know that we expected hundreds of public servants to join today. Many are federal employees. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for what you do, for your work. I know you've been under increased strain during the pandemic. It's been a challenging time. And we know that government and nonprofit workers have provided essential services, helping Oregonians and Americans get connected with the resources they need. So your service is appreciated. So I'm honored to represent Northwest Oregon, and I serve on the Education and Labor Committee, where I am the chair of the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Human Services. Education, the cost of college, those are important priorities for me in Washington, D.C., because they reflect the needs I hear about in the district I represent. And also because of my personal story. I attended community college in Eugene, Oregon, and then went to the University of Oregon and then to law school, all 7 years with a combination of grants, loans, and work study because my parents were not in a position to help me. So that was 7 years of manageable amount of debt after that time. And I actually went into public service after graduating from law school. I worked for the Federal Trade Commission, and I was able to repay my loans. But today, too many families, students, and graduates face a very different reality. College was a lot less expensive and living costs were a lot less when I went to school. And the burden of student debt is a significant problem for many. The pandemic, of course, has introduced additional financial strain. And I've been working with my colleagues and others to make sure borrowers get the flexibility and compassion they need. And there have been, of course, pauses in repayment. And then earlier this month, I introduced the Student Loan Borrower Safety Net Act, and this is to help borrowers of federal student loans during the transition period following the end of the COVID-19 student loan repayment pause. So this bill will make it easier for borrowers to enroll in income-driven repayment, make it easier to access economic hardship support, and also provide a back-end protection for those who miss out on payments. But even before the pandemic, I heard about the challenges from many of my constituents and public servants about what they're facing and faced with the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Borrowers across Oregon expressed a lot of anxiety about the program. They had made academic, financial, and career decisions based on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, and now have had to put life decisions like when to marry and have children or buy a home on hold because of burdensome debt. And that is debt that was promised to be forgiven in exchange for a commitment to public service. So just a brief summary of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program passed back in 2007, and it was really intended to encourage students to pursue public service. And the benefit was that discharge of the balance after paying for 10 years. But unfortunately, for too many, including many of you in this Zoom, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness was an empty promise. And I heard countless stories from public sector workers diligently making payments for 10 years, only to be told that they were in the wrong payment plan, or their payments didn't count, or as one educator told me, because your school didn't put the right stamp on her application. So I want to note how the pandemic has underscored the value of public sector jobs in our communities. People like teachers, first responders, healthcare workers, nonprofit leaders, all people I've spoken with about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And now today we have some better news. the Biden administration is really now finally delivering on the promise of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Our Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, announced changes to the program that will expand eligibility of forgiveness to borrowers, importantly, count thousands of previously uncounted payments toward forgiveness, and in some cases, provide full forgiveness of the loan balance. The majority of the public service loan forgiveness casework that comes to my office is about the qualified payment count and a discrepancy between the borrower and the student loan servicer. Many borrowers were not made aware that the payments they made were not qualified for some reason, and therefore they lost credit for months or even years. So I'm very excited to see this important and needed policy change, which would be transformational for thousands of borrowers. And to help me through this, to explain this, I'm very grateful that we have Mike Pierce with us today. Mike is Executive Director at the Student Borrower Protection Center. He's an attorney, student borrower advocate, former senior regulator. He joined the Student Borrower Protection Center after serving as Deputy Assistant Director at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And prior to that, Mike worked for a member of Congress and also at the U.S. Department of Education. So we're so honored and grateful that he's with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike for his presentation before we take your questions.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, and really thank you all for joining today and for tuning in to learn more about this spectacular opportunity to finally get credit for your public service and actually get your loans canceled. This has been a lot of hard work from a lot of people, particularly from the Congresswoman, who has sent letters and harangued staff of administrations of both parties to try to make this this program actually work as intended. And deliver the debt relief that's been promised to Oregonians with student debt. And I should also note that I'm coming to you guys live from Portland too. I live here. This isn't just me doing outreach here. I'm happy to help people in Oregon, my fellow Oregonians, actually get the debt relief they deserve. So with that, I'm going to walk through some slides here that provide an overview of what changed, how the program works, what this opportunity is. But really, I think we're really excited to do some Q&A with people. There are lots of detailed questions that folks have about how this all works and how this all works for them. And we're happy to answer them to the best that we can. And I'm going to share our organization's website a few times. As the Congresswoman mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. We are a nonprofit organization that advocates on behalf of people with student debt. And what that actually means is that we help push the administration to deliver on borrowers' rights. We help hold student loan companies accountable when they cheat student loan borrowers by through litigation, through policy advocacy, and we do research on the effects of the student debt crisis on people, on the economy, and on communities. And so all of that work really focuses very finely on helping connect people with debt relief. And so in that vein, I'm really happy to be here today. So first, just as a kind of a quick overview about what public service loan forgiveness is, and then we'll talk about what's changed and why that's great for people working in public service. More than a decade ago, back in 2007, Congress passed a law that said if you work in public service, you have a right to get your debt canceled if you spend a decade working in public service. And there are a bunch of strings attached, a bunch of kind of tricks and traps along the way that have really made it very, very difficult for people to get public service loan forgiveness. But the four requirements of the program are that you have direct loans, a specific kind of federal student loan. And I'll talk about why that's changing for just a little while. But generally, if you went to college or grad school after 2010, and you took out a federal student loan, it's probably a direct loan. It is the most common kind of student loan now, but back when the program was created in 2007, most people got loans through another program, and those loans were made by banks or lenders like Sallie Mae, and they didn't count unless you took some extra steps. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means, but just as a starting place, if you have direct loans, you've checked the first box, you have the right type of loan. The next requirement that trips people up is often people are in the wrong kind of repayment plan. But if you're making payments based on your income, that acronym there is IDR, it means income-driven repayment, you're also on track. So if you have a direct loan and you've been making income-driven repayment payments, you are 10 steps ahead of most public service workers. And you've managed to overcome the two biggest hurdles that have knocked people off track in the past. You also have to work full-time for a public service employer, and we'll talk about that definition in a second, but that's generally anybody that works for a 501c3 nonprofit, a government agency or a school district. And then you have to do that for 10 years. You have to make payments on your loan under this payment plan while working in public service full-time for 10 years. And 10 years of monthly payments is 120 payments. During COVID, this has changed a little bit. So if you're working in public service right now, you haven't had to make a student loan payment going all the way back to March 2020. That's offered a relief just in time for millions of people across the country. This is not unique to public service workers. It's anybody with a student loan that's held by the US Department of Education, which is the vast majority of people with federal student loans. But what that also means is while you're not making payments, you're still getting credit towards public service loan forgiveness. There are, again, some tricks and traps here. You do need to meet those other criteria. So you have to have your payment paused on a direct loan. And you have to be working full-time in public service while the payment pause is going on. And lots of people have lost their jobs or had their hours reduced, and that's kind of chipped away at some of the benefit that this payment pause has offered for people working in public service. But if you have managed to keep your job throughout the pandemic and you work in public service and you're still working in public service, that period where you're not making payments does count towards PSLF. And that counts because of a law the Congresswoman supported that the Congress passed back in March 2020 called the CARES Act. So this was way back in the Trump administration. And this is not part of this new special opportunity. If you were working in public service during the payment pause, you got that credit. That has already been earned by you, as long as you've already met the other requirements of the program. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. So as the Congresswoman mentioned, she's heard from borrowers across Oregon, and we've certainly talked to thousands of borrowers across the country who knew something about loan forgiveness, maybe reached out to their student loan company and asked for advice, or read something on the Department of Education's website, and it turns out it was wrong, that the steps that you needed to take to be able to connect those dots and actually qualify were not the steps that you took when you first were starting out in your career. And you discovered 3, 4, 5, 9, 10 years into your career in public service that you needed to start over. The first thing I could say is that it's not your fault. The student loan companies that were hired by the Department of Education to run this program, particularly back in 2007, 2008, were routinely giving people wrong information. Many of them were sued by state attorneys general, by classes of borrowers, by federal regulators. There were investigations conducted by federal regulators. And what we found was that routinely borrowers were given wrong information. They were knocked off track. And part of the case that was made here to fix this really broken program that was rejecting 99 out of 100 people that applied, it did get better over time. A year later, 98 out of every 100 people were still being rejected. And where everybody landed, where policymakers and members of Congress and borrower advocates and legal assistance attorneys and public service organizations, and in particular organized labor, landed was the idea that we just couldn't pick around the edges anymore. It wasn't appropriate. It wasn't fair to this generation of public service workers to come up with another fix that involves jumping through another set of hoops that is impossibly complicated and full of kind of gotcha requirements. And so instead, the Biden administration asked public service workers and organizations and their advocates what should be done here. And over the summer, nearly 50,000 public service workers shared their stories with the Biden administration. Members of Congress wrote letters. We had organizations representing teachers and firefighters and nurses and doctors and public defenders and healthcare workers from across the country share their story, not just about how public service loan forgiveness was failing, but how serving in public service during the pandemic has been an extra burden. And in response, the Biden administration took stock of this set of concerns, both the long-term ones with people getting lied to by their student loan companies and government officials mismanaging the program, but also the short-term stress that's facing public service workers, and opened up this time-limited waiver of a bunch of the requirements that I just laid out. An opportunity for borrowers to sweep away a bunch of the things that have tripped up people in the past and just give people credit based on their service. And so now, if you've been in repayment over the course of the past, since 2007, for more than a decade, for any 10-year chunk of that, you can get your debts canceled right now, as long as you've been in repayment on a federal student loan. Doesn't matter what kind of student loan, a federal student loan that is. It doesn't matter whether you're in the right kind of repayment plan. As long as you've been working full-time in public service and you've been doing that while in repayment on a student loan, you can get your debt canceled. And everybody else that hasn't been working in public service for a full decade can get credit for the time that they've spent in repayment. So what that means, I'm going to use a little bit of jargon here, and we can talk about the jargon some during Q&A as well. But what that means is that if you have one of those older federal loans, known as a Federal Family Education Loan, or FFEL loan, or Ffel loan, these are the loans that were made by Citibank or Sallie Mae back before 2010. Most people with a federal student loan before 2010 had one of these older loans. You can now get credit for your public service work if you had one of these older loans, or if you had a Perkins loan that was made by your school. You need to consolidate that, and I'll talk about what that means in a minute, but there's a step you need to take to be able to get credit. But if you've already taken that step, the education department is automatically giving people credit for the time they've served if they have a direct consolidation loan that includes one of these older loans in it. And so far, the Department of Education has canceled 30,000 public service workers loans, more than $1 billion worth of student debt owed by public service workers, and they're just getting started. And our organization is estimating that by the time this is all said and done, it could be 1 million people that end up debt-free because of this change in practices here. And so in addition to giving people a way forward, if they have one of these older Ffel loans, you can also get credit no matter what payment plan you were on. So if you enrolled in a plan that stretched your loan term out for 30 years, instead of enrolling in a plan that lets you pay based on your income, you're now good to go. And a lot of that is also going to happen automatically. There are still some steps you need to take, and I'll talk about the mechanics of what those are in just a moment. But you do get credit if you served in the military too. There's some additional waivers that are happening here for military borrowers, because routinely people were told to defer their loans if they were serving in the military instead of taking the steps they needed to get on track for PSLF. And very, very few military borrowers were ever able to get credit towards PSLF in the past. For military borrowers especially, a lot of this is happening automatically. There aren't as many additional steps you need to take, and I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. And then most importantly, for folks that have had trouble staying in public service during the pandemic, the Biden administration recognizes that the pandemic's caused a ton of challenges for people trying to stay in the workforce, particularly people working in public service in state and local government that have seen layoffs across the country during the pandemic. You don't need to be working in public service today to apply for public service loan forgiveness under this special waiver. If you lost your job during the pandemic, but you served previously for 10 years under all of these new this special program with fewer requirements, you can still raise your hand and get your debt canceled. It's not completely automatic. And that's frustrating. It's frustrating for us as advocates that we're trying to push for the most streamlined and simplest process possible. But it's better than it was. And what that means is that if you have one of these older loans that didn't qualify before, and again, I'm using some jargon here and we can talk about that, you do have to consolidate. It means you have to go to studentaid.gov and fill out an application to pay off your old loans with a new direct loan. And that new direct loan is eligible to be canceled. You also have to fill out a form called an employer certification form, or ECF. That's how the government knows that you've been working in public service. It's a really short form. You fill out the dates you worked in public service, you sign it, you have your employer sign it, and you send it to the government. And at that point, they're able to tell if you've been serving in public service and what kind of loan you have and what your loan status has been. And automatically from that point on, they'll evaluate whether you're eligible for public service loan forgiveness. And if you are, they'll cancel your debt. And if they won't, they'll just give you an update of how many months you've made progress towards PSLF, and you can finish out your public service career and get your debt canceled in the future. For military borrowers, as I mentioned just a moment ago, a lot of this is going to happen automatically, including the employer certification process. The government's getting records from the Defense Department now. So every military borrower is going to get their debts canceled if they're eligible, as opposed to making folks that have been serving our country raise their hand and jump through a bunch of hoops. But borrowers with these older loans, they're at the most risk of missing out. And that's because if you don't consolidate, the Biden administration can't cancel your debt. And I'm going to come back to this in just a second as well. But it's really important to know that if you have a loan that's not a direct loan, you do have to take action here to be able to get credit. and there's a deadline to act. You have to take these steps by October 31st, 2022. So we have 1 year to get as many public service workers as possible to get their debts canceled. And we're working hard with a coalition of labor unions representing public service workers across the country, including American Federation of Teachers and AFT Oregon, the National Education Association, AFSCME, SEIU, to try to find every public service worker that's eligible and connect them with their right to loan forgiveness. And we have fantastic champions in Congress, like Congresswoman Bonamici, who is fighting every day to make sure this works and that these rights actually get delivered for people. There are still some tricks and traps along the way. And so I wouldn't be doing my job here if I just told you everything was going to be perfect. You do have to know how to navigate this process a little bit, even though it's better and it's not going to deny 99 out of every 100 people that apply, you do have to apply. And so you have to apply by this deadline. And to do that, you have to take one of the steps that I mentioned so far, just to be able to get the process started by October 31st of 2022. You have to either consolidate an old loan, or you have to submit an employer certification that documents your public service, or do both. If you do both, that's how you actually get all the way to the end of the process and get your debt canceled. There are some people that are going to be left out, and we are still advocating in Washington to try to fix that. But as of right now, it is only for people who are getting loans, who have loans that paid for their own education. It doesn't cover, with an exception that I can talk about, but it doesn't cover most people that have parent plus loans that took out a loan to pay for a child or grandchild's college. It relies on the same student loan servicing companies that have lied to borrowers regularly over the past decade. And it's really important that if something seems wrong or off, or you're getting bad information, that you do reach out to a regulator for help. And I'll talk about how to get help in just a moment as well. It's also, you could absolutely reach out to Congresswoman Bonamici's office. She has an amazing district staff that's here to help figure out exactly these kinds of problems. You do have to take action. So it's important to know that the education department and the education department's contracted student loan companies, they don't necessarily have every borrower's contact information. And so if you have one of these older loans, or you know somebody else that does, you need to spread the word, because people are not going to get proactive information necessarily if they have one of these older loans that you need to take these extra steps. And then at the same time as all this is going on, unfortunately, this pause in student loan payments looks like it is likely to end in 2022. A lot of us have been working really hard to try to get that deadline extended out into the future, because we know the pandemic isn't over, the economy hasn't recovered, people are still struggling. But it seems like the Biden administration is likely to restart student loan payments on February 1st, 2022, at the same time as a number of the student loan companies that handle these loans are going to be leaving the student loan business. So there's going to be a lot of change that happens at the same time as public service workers are raising their hands and asking for help and trying to get their questions answered. So that's just a thing to be aware of. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get your right to debt cancellation here. It just means that there are potentially some potholes along the way. And that's why we're here, to help you navigate that process. So what do borrowers need to know? And here I'm going to get a little bit more specific. And then we're really excited to answer some questions here. Do you need to take action? So I mentioned this a couple times, and it's worth repeating. You need to check up on your student loan account and figure out what kind of loans you have, whether you have one of those older loans, an FFEL loan or a Perkins loan that's made by your school, or whether you have a direct loan. If you have a loan that requires you to take some extra steps, you have to consolidate. The next question is, do you have a qualified public interest employer? Do you work in public service? And then, have you ever certified that public service with the federal government in the past? And if so, when did you do it? So to figure out what kind of loan you have, you can go to studentaid.gov, and there's lots of resources on the education department's website, studentaid.gov, that can help you navigate this process, but also our organization's website, protectborrowers.org/PSLF. We have very short instructional videos on how to navigate each step of the process here, how to figure out what kind of loan you have, how to consolidate those loans, how to figure out if you have a qualified employer. So just know that there's a lot of jargon here. This can be very confusing, but there's lots of really smart people that are here to help you, and that can help you connect the dots. So if you have a loan other than a direct loan, you do have to go to studentaid.gov and consolidate that loan. If you've already consolidated your loan, or if you just have direct loans, you don't need to take this step. You can figure out if you have a public service employer that qualifies. Also at studentaid.gov, there's a tool called the Pslf help tool. And that was just updated over Thanksgiving. It has new information about this waiver, and it's here to help you connect the dots. And it's really quite good. Underneath it all is a list of every single public service organization in the country that's ever been approved for Pslf. And so you can actually match your employer with the database the education department has, and you can kind of pre-confirm that you're going to be on track. If your employer's not listed, it's not a big deal. You can still qualify. But this is a great way for people, particularly that work in the nonprofit sector, to follow in the footsteps of their coworkers that have already navigated their way through this process. And then the last thing you need to figure out here is if you've ever certified your employment before, if you have employer certification forms that have covered 10 years or more, then you may not have to do anything at all if you have a direct loan. There are lots of people in this boat. In fact, 30,000 people were already in this boat when the special opportunity was announced back in October. And as of the end of last month, all 30,000 of them have had their loans canceled. That's more than $1 billion worth of debt cancellation that's happened just in the past 6 weeks. If you have not certified your full 10 years worth of service, you can go to studentaid.gov and use that same Pslf help tool to fill out the paperwork that you need to certify your service. You still need to have your employer sign it. You still need to submit it, but it will help you fill out the paperwork. It will help you check the right boxes, make sure you're not leaving anything out on your form. And it will help you raise your hand and tell the Biden administration that you're ready to have your debt canceled. So there are a couple of important takeaways here I want to walk through, and then I think we're ready for some questions. The biggest things here are, because of the special opportunity, credit will be given for any months of service that you've spent since 2007, since October 1st, 2007. It doesn't matter what kind of loan you have. It doesn't matter what payment plan you were in. If you have been working full-time, if you've been working full-time in public service since October 1st, 2007, you will get credit towards public service loan forgiveness as long as you've been in repayment on a student loan, on a federal student loan. Again, I want to remind you all about the deadline. October 31st, 2022 is the deadline to start this process, to start taking these steps. The sooner the better, though. People are getting their debts canceled right now. So if you consolidate your loans and then certify your service, you can get your debt canceled. You don't need to wait to the deadline. You should confirm what type of loan you have. You should confirm who your employer is. You should consolidate if you need to. You should certify your service. You can do all of that at studentaid.gov. And if something feels off, if you're getting bad information, if something your student loan company told you doesn't seem right, if the information I'm telling you now is different than the information you heard somewhere else, you can find out the correct information at studentaid.gov, but you can submit a complaint through the Congresswoman's office or directly to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at consumerfinance.gov. There's still a lot of bad information out there. It's great that you're here. Being on this webinar is the first step. But there's also a lot that we can do to make sure that this goes smoothly over the course of the next year. And so I think with that, it's time for some Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. And do you mind just closing out your share screen?
I sure can.
So now Congresswoman Bonamici and Mike Pierce look forward to taking your questions. As I said at the beginning, more than 600 people registered today. If you would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. We have some great ones in there already, and I will read those aloud. If you need further assistance, please contact our office or your member of Congress. If you live in Northwest Oregon, you can reach us by going to bonamici.house.gov and then clicking on Contact. For more information or assistance from the Student Borrower Protection Center, go to protectborrowers.org. So our first question today is from Ben, and Ben says, I've been a federal employee since 2008, working as a wildland firefighter, both as a hotshot and now a smoke jumper. The Pslf program was difficult to navigate, and after a few years, I gave up on applying for relief. I still have about $12,000 in debt. Is there any relief for someone like me, which I feel is a pretty common situation? Thanks.
I just want to say thank you, Ben, for your work and for joining us. And I hope there's relief for you. I'm going to turn it over to Mike on the specifics, but you're certainly in a situation where you've been working in public service. And I'm glad you joined us today. As Mike said, that's a first step. And I'm sorry you had to give up, but it's a story I've heard again and again about how frustrating the process has been. So we're hoping that this new waiver program smooths that out and helps people like you. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it will. And I want to echo the Congresswoman and say thank you for your service. That's a tough job, and as an Oregonian, I'm really grateful for it. As long as you still have a federal student loan, if you've just been making payments on the same loan you've had from the beginning, you should be in good shape. You should be able to get credit for your public service work, and the remainder of your debt should be canceled. I would warn one pothole that folks have been stuck in. Lots of people refinance their loans with companies like SoFi or Earnest, where it's a private student loan that pays off your older federal student loan. This does not cover private student loans. So if you did refinance your student loan, you probably are going to miss out. That's a relatively small number of people. But for everybody else, if you just tried to figure it out, you couldn't make heads or tails of it back in 2007, but you've been working in public service this whole time and making payments, you should be good. This is built for you.
Thanks, Mike.
Excellent. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee who says, "Hi, I'm a federal worker and I'm in the PSLF program. My children have grown up and left home, but like many of the Gen X generation, I'm now providing for my elderly parents. I provide more than half of their living expenses. How can I show this when submitting income-based repayment forms and receive credit for it? I can't claim them on my tax return, but I support them nonetheless."
Oh, that's a great question. Mike, do you know the answer to that?
So the definition the Education Department uses for a dependent, if you're enrolling in income-driven repayment, is not the same definition that the IRS uses. If you're providing support for your parents, and we can make sure to send around what the actual definition is and make sure that it lines up with your experience. But there are lots of people that have either elder care or just adult children that they take care of that can count them as a dependent for the purposes of income-driven repayment, even if they don't file their taxes treating them as a dependent. So the answer is it depends. I don't know your unique situation with enough detail to be able to give you like a legal recommendation, but it sounds like you might fit into that category where you are providing more than half of the financial support for another individual. You can count them as a dependent for IDR, even if you can't count them as a dependent for tax purposes.
And I just want to say, if you live in the district I represent, please feel free to contact my office and we can help you sort that out. I know as someone who helped care for elderly parents, it's important work, it's valuable work, and that should be recognized. So we can help you out.
Exactly. There are many excellent questions in the Q&A function. Feel free to contact our office directly at bonamici.house.gov or go to protectborrowers.org. Our next question is from Teresa. Teresa says, "I've seen many people receiving forgiveness and receiving refunds. However, I can't find any information on how they're working through the borrowers to determine a protocol for forgiveness and refunds. It seems very random and very stressful. I'm wondering if I've been bypassed or not, and what's the time frame?" And further, she says, "For refunds, if you consolidated FFEL loans into direct loans, how are the refunds being determined? Is it only on the direct loans or do the FFEL payments count?"
I'm going to let Mike take that one. But thank you. That's a great question.
That is a great question and kind of a complicated one. So unfortunately, as far as the government is concerned, from the minute you consolidate your loans, that's the point that they are on the hook to potentially refund your payments if you make more payments than you need beyond 120 monthly payments. Unfortunately, there's no looking back into a Ffel loan and getting money back for an FFEL loan. So you are potentially eligible now to get credit towards public service loan forgiveness and get your loans canceled. But the current waiver does not offer refunds for folks that have paid more than 120 payments on an FFEL loan. There are lots of people who have made more than 120 payments on a direct loan and are applying for public service loan forgiveness. Those borrowers are generally, but not always, eligible to get the payments that they've made beyond 120 months refunded to them. The waiver makes that a little bit complicated. A typical public service worker who follows the old public service loan forgiveness rules and made it to 120 months would get 121, 122, 123 refunded to them. That's not always true for the waiver. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds into your exact circumstance, but it seems likely that you would get any payments you made on your direct loans refunded to you. It is very unlikely that you would get any payments made on your Ffel loans refunded to you.
Thank you, Mike.
We'll try to get to as many of these awesome questions as we can. Our next one is from Lori, who says, we always had to file married separately due to my horrid loan situation, even though I made over 10 years of payments. For tax year 2021, can my spouse and I finally file jointly since there were no payments due to COVID, and then change our filing status accordingly year after year?
Again, I'm not in a great position to provide you with individual tax advice. I think that's a complicated question. Certainly, your tax status in 2020 did not determine your 2021 payments because everyone's 2021 payments were paused. Moving forward, I think you just need to talk to your tax preparer or look for kind of more general advice on studentaid.gov. But your 2021 salary will determine your student loan payments in 2022 when payments restart. And so you should think carefully about how you file. If your expectation is you're going to get your debt canceled in 2021 because you qualify for this waiver and you won't have any student loans in 2022, that seems like a perfectly reasonable reason to finally file jointly. But again, I'm not in a position to give you individual tax advice.
Yes, and unfortunately, I can't do that either. However, if you do need help answering that question, you don't have a tax advisor, we do have constituent workers who have a liaison at Treasury. So please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Our next question is from Cameron, who says, I entered public service during the pandemic. Can I still count payment pause months toward my repayment if I'm just now enrolling in a repayment plan?
Absolutely. So as long as you're working in public service right now, the law says, and the president's executive order that extended the law says, you get credit for your time working in public service while payments are paused. You do not need to have previously been a public service worker. That's only going to extend back to the time you entered repayment on your student loans. So that won't cover anytime you were still in school, for example. But if you've been working full-time in public service during the period that your payments are paused, it doesn't matter whether you were in repayment before or if you're a recent graduate, that counts.
Some good news.
A lot of good news.
There's lots of good news here. I'm trying to be in the good news business for a change. It's good.
That's great. Marianne asks, my question, how do you expect the new Pslf changes to be impacted by the fact that Fed loan servicing will no longer be servicing federal student loans?
So again, some mixed news on that front. The Education Department just announced that it had extended Fed loan servicing's contract for another year. So it will run all the way through the end of the waiver period. Fed loan servicing will be your student loan servicer through the time of the waiver and will be responsible for helping you connect the dots and making sure you get your debt canceled. The good news is you won't have to go through a change and risk getting records lost or other kind of disruption. The bad news is that it's still Fed loan servicing, and Fed loan servicing has been responsible for messing this program up from the jump. And so that's why it's so important that you understand your rights and you ask for help if you get bad permission.
Thanks, Mike. The next question is from Kara, who says, thank you so much for the efforts, CARES Act, everything you're doing for us. It's been tough during the pandemic. The repayment pause was very helpful. For those of us who's worked under temporary hiring authority, like seasonal workers, 1039, student temporary employment, will those years of service also count?
Thank you for that question. And I was really inspired to see that there was already all that work done on what entities had been already certified as qualified for public service. So you could start looking there, and then I'll turn it over to Mike and see if he has some additional advice.
Yeah, so I would say that the current rules don't require you to be a W-2 employee. So you don't have to be a full-time employee for payroll purposes by your employer. So if you are a 1099 contractor that is working more than 30 hours per week for a public service organization, and your employer is willing to sign a form that says you are a full-time employee for the purposes of public service loan forgiveness, you may be able to get credit. It depends on how that appears on your taxes. 1099s can be complicated. Often employers are not willing to call a person that's an independent contractor a full-time employee for any purposes. And so you may not be able to actually get credit, but the program rules don't specify specifically that you are a W-2 employee. So we have heard people, particularly people that work for smaller nonprofits, that their nonprofits are willing to kind of work with them to help figure out how to navigate PSLF. That's kind of a lawyerly answer. I know that that's not super helpful, but basically the rules don't prohibit it, but they don't really give you a place to go. And so that's actually a nice segue. There are new rules being written for the program right now. The education department is in the process of figuring out what those rules will be moving forward. And there may ultimately be some special accommodations made for people that are doing public service type work, even if they're not able to meet the public service organization definitions. And that's happening right now. We will continue to stay in touch with folks about that as that work is ongoing. And we'll know more during 2022 about what shape those take. So that's not part of the waiver right now. The rules are silent on that question. You may have a way forward depending on whether your employer is willing to play ball with you, but there may be some hope on the horizon.
And Mike, what will you remind everybody, what's the definition for the PSLF program of full-time?
So full-time right now is working 30 hours per week. And there's also a seasonal component. So it's for at least 8 months of a year. So for example, a classroom teacher that has a contract that only covers the school year is still considered a public service worker for all 12 months of the year, even if their contract is only an 8-month contract.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Combining a couple anonymous questions here. Do the payments need to be consecutive? What if you miss a payment? And what if you lose your job in between and there's a gap, but you find a new public service job later?
So the good news to all of those questions is you are not knocked off track. If you lose your job or you miss a payment, they do not need to be consecutive. It obviously will slow down your progress towards loan forgiveness because the times that you're not working in public service aren't public service work. But as long as you have spent 120 individual months working in public service, it doesn't matter over how many years, and you will still be eligible to get your debt canceled.
More good news.
Thank you. A question from Lane here. Lane says, I'm terrified to consolidate because I've lost my matched months every other time that I consolidated or changed payment plans in the past. What's different now? And how can I be sure to retain the payments I've already made when consolidating?
Elaine, that's a great question. And I had heard from many people in the same situation. They had thought they were doing the right thing. They tried to fix it. And then as they discovered they hadn't made the right type of consolidation, or they didn't submit the correct paperwork, for example. So hopefully you can get somebody to help, and maybe Mike can talk through the situation that you're in right now.
Sure. So that's what changed. The good news is that for the first time, consolidating your loans doesn't force you to lose credit for everything that came before the consolidation. So the Department of Education, just for this year, is going to look through not just a new consolidation, but any past consolidation too, all the way back to the day you started making payments on your first federal student loans. And whatever the date is that you started making payment on your oldest federal student loan, that's the date that starts the clock for public service loan forgiveness. And so even if you've taken on some additional loans along the way, you've consolidated your loans, you've started, you've stopped, they're going to look back to that first date you first entered repayment, and they're going to count every month that you were in repayment on a loan, no matter what the payment plan is. And they're going to add all of that up. And if they get to 120, they'll cancel your loans. And if they don't get to 120, they'll give you credit for whatever that number is.
I just want to emphasize, this is a really significant action on the part of the education department to do this, to recognize that this was a broken promise for so many, and to give people the opportunity to really fulfill that promise. And as I mentioned, people made their often career decisions and borrowing decisions and academic decisions based on this promise. So I'm really grateful to the secretary and to the education department for recognizing that. So thanks. We have more questions. Looks like a lot. Yeah.
We have a lot more questions. We'll get to as many as we can. David says, Sally Mae and then Navient didn't tell me I was in a higher repayment plan than necessary for PSLF. Then telling me that my payments weren't eligible for PSLF was insulting since I had paid more than was needed. I'm glad the issue has been addressed, but what about the thousands of dollars I've spent on the higher than needed payments over the years? Is there a way to hold Sally Mae or Navient responsible for their injurious advice?
What do you think, Mike?
Well, the good news is that both Navient and I shouldn't say it's good news. The only shot at justice you have here is that both Navient and Sallie Mae are currently the defendants in lawsuits brought by state attorneys general and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for exactly the set of circumstances you describe, for putting people in repayment arrangements that are more expensive than income-driven repayment. That's a case that I worked on back when I was in the government. It's been in litigation since 2017. We hope that there's some resolution that's coming that's going to put some money back in the pockets of the people that were cheated out of their rights by those two companies in particular.
Thanks, Mike. There's a question here from Valerie that gets at the larger issue of student loan forgiveness beyond PSLF that I thought the Congresswoman might want to speak to. Valerie says, if we could get the interest reduced on our current loans, that would be great. Could you talk to that bigger issue here for folks who are not only public servants?
Absolutely. And thank you for that question, Valerie. And it's a concern that I've heard over the years. Why is it so expensive? Why can you refinance to a lower interest rate on other products, but not on a student loan? And we've had many conversations about that. And certainly in the Education and Labor Committee, we've been working on the reauthorization or the rewrite of the Higher Education Act. I think really getting at the root of the issue is that higher education is too expensive. And I'm hopeful that we can find a way to reduce those payments, to forgive some payments along the way, reduce the interest rates and forgive some payments. Where we've come into some conflict is how do we pay for that? Because there is a cost for that. To me, it's a good investment to make sure that people have the confidence to get the higher education that gets them on a path to a career and a future. So we haven't been able to do that yet, but as part of the Higher Education Act, looking at both, short-term, helping people with current student debt, but also long-term, just making sure that it's not as expensive to go to college and to higher education, graduate school. I've had conversations with people, for example, in graduate programs with a tremendous amount of debt. So it's a problem we need to solve. I'm very aware of it. And I'm hopeful that we can come up with a resolution for, as I mentioned, current borrowers with that amount of debt and high rates. And income-driven repayment, if you haven't looked at that, might be helpful.
The next question is from Kathy. Kathy says, I'm a 20-year federal employee and planning to return to college to finish my bachelor's degree. Is there a similar program for public service employees who are graduating after October 2022 and not currently holding a student loan?
My understanding, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program will continue. It's not going to end, and hopefully it'll continue in a way that really does live up to its promise.
I think that's exactly right. And we mentioned before that there's new rules being written for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And by the time you get done with school, hopefully those new rules will be in place and all the things that knocked all those tens of thousands of people off track over the past decade won't apply. And you'll have a much easier path forward.
I think it's great you're going back to school. Good for you. That's wonderful.
Good luck. Our next question is from Frank. Frank says, what sort of ETA do we have on when the servicers will have the ECF, the employment certification forms, reevaluated? I'm concerned about their ability to do this accurately.
Mike, any thoughts?
I think your concerns about them being able to do this accurately are very reasonable, given how challenging this program has been over the past decade. They are pushing as hard as they can to get as many of these forms processed as fast as they can. I am not here to be an apologist for the student loan industry or for the way that the government has handled PSLF in the past. And I'll be really frank, you should watch carefully. If something doesn't seem wrong, doesn't seem right, please do go to the Congresswoman's office or go to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Mistakes are going to happen here. And actually, just 2 weeks ago, we had to threaten to sue Fed Loan Servicing for providing people with bad information about the new requirements here. We are here. We also are happy to talk to you if you feel like you are having the rules misapplied to your account, or if you are having your payments miscounted. It seems entirely likely that there will end up being some consumer protection lawsuits to be able to stand up for public service workers when things go wrong here. I think trust but verify is the right mantra here. The Biden administration is trying to do everything in its power to deliver for you, but the system is broken and we're going to need to hold people accountable if we do.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to add too, and this is sort of in general, but specifically with working on this issue, make sure that you keep a really accurate record of your conversations, who you talk to, emails that you sent. Keep track of it. And I remember doing a public service loan forgiveness or public service loan payment roundtable conversation. And one of the few people, one of the 1% in 2017 or 2% in 2018 who actually had their balances forgiven, said it was because she kept a very accurate record of every phone call, every conversation that she had, so she could go back and say, this is what you told me and this is what I told you. And so just keep good track. It will help you sort that out.
And just a couple clarifying points to questions in the question and answer. This process is the same whether you live in Oregon or whether you live elsewhere. Our office can help you if you live in Northwest Oregon. Go to bonamici.house.gov. If you live somewhere else, your member of Congress can help you too, and we can help direct you to that person if you're not sure who it is. To reach Mike's organization, the Student Borrower Protection Center, go to protectborrowers.org. And tomorrow we will send out the video from today's webinar along with some links to more resources. So look for that follow-up email if you registered today. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee who says, I've been a federal employee for about 15 years. I applied for forgiveness a few times years ago and was told I was ineligible. I worked hard to repay my loans and I'm done. I'm heartened to hear this program is moving forward. I'm also pretty bummed to have missed out based on what I hear was false information. What are my options, if any?
Oh, good question, Mike.
So unfortunately, the Biden administration's actions aren't going to do, I should say, the U.S. Department of Education's actions aren't going to do much for you. Folks who have paid off their loans are not covered in the group of people that are going to benefit from the waivers here. As I mentioned before, there aren't refunds coming to folks who raise their hand now for this kind of special treatment. The only real hope here, I think, is that there are some enforcement actions that are still going on against student loan companies, not just Navient and Sallie Mae, but also FedLoan. The New York Attorney General is in year 3 or 4 of litigation against FedLoan on behalf of public service workers that have been misled or otherwise cheated out of their rights. If you live in Massachusetts, there's already a settlement in place between the Massachusetts Attorney General and FedLoan. If you think it was FedLoan that gave you bad information, you should check out the Massachusetts Attorney General's website about their settlement with FedLoan for public service workers. That does only apply to Massachusetts public service workers, but there may be money there too. So it's a long road. It may not be a lot, but there are people that are still fighting for borrowers who were cheated or lied to that may not be covered by this action.
Right. You might also inquire with the Oregon Attorney General as well, with their office.
There are a lot of questions about how to get the employment certification form and if each employer needs to do that. For instance, somebody who said, I worked for 3 employers in the past 5 years, do they all need to complete that form? And also people who've worked for multiple federal agencies, wondering if each one of those federal agencies needs to complete the form.
My understanding they do, Mike.
Yeah, that's right. They do. For federal employees, things might get easier, but it hasn't changed yet. The Department of Education, the day that they announced this waiver, also announced that it was going to try to match with the Central Office of Personnel Management records of all federal employees going back to 2007. That's a big undertaking. That has not happened yet. I would not rely on that to be able to get loan forgiveness. But in the future, hopefully, if you're a federal employee in particular, you don't have to go from agency to certify. Right now, though, you do. You have to have your service certified by each individual public service employer. And if you're a Fed, that's each individual agency that employed you.
A little bit complicated, but we wish you all good luck in that process. There's an anonymous question from someone who says, thank you for holding this informational meeting. I've been working for the federal government since 2010, and I'm also serving in the Army Reserve. I have $102,000 in student loans and consolidated my loans into the direct federal loan program at the beginning of my federal career. For whatever reason, I've only been given credit since 2015. Is there a way to get my number of payments recalculated?
Mike, I know you spoke about people who are serving.
Yeah, so that's another place where that should happen automatically, and that's actually happening on a faster timetable than other federal workers. So where you were activated on the reserves and you were serving on active duty full time, that service should get applied to your student loan account automatically. That's happening right now. If you haven't received an email about that, you should by the end of the year. For your non-active duty military service, you can always request that Fed Loan Servicing recalculate your account here and take a look back and audit the months that you've been in repayment. It is also necessary that you certify, like you fill out one of those employer certification forms at studentaid.gov. You can use the PSLF help tool to do that. But you certify all 10 years of your service, both the active duty military portion and your other service. And if they have records certifying all of your public service work over that period of time, they should be able to go back through using these new guidelines and give you credit for your full service where you've been making payments. And if you used a military deferment while you were serving on active duty, if you were called up out of the reserves, you'll also get credit for that period. And that's brand new as well. That was not the case until October of this year.
I want to add an issue that I hear about from people, and I see some of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A. People say, how do I know if my employer is a public service employer? And sometimes it seems logical and sometimes it just doesn't. People just, what's the best source for people to go look to see? In addition to, you said there's the site where other employers have already been considered to be public service. But where's the best source of information if people are saying, if I work for this particular kind of agency, or if I work for a nonprofit, are they all going to be qualified or not? Where's the best way to get that question answered?
The PSLF help tool on the education department's website is the best place to go for that information. And that wasn't always the case. That's really only been online for a bit more than a year. And it's only had information about the public service loan forgiveness waiver, what we're here to talk about today, for the past week. So this is your moment. From now until the end of October, there's accurate information to be found there. You can check up on your employer. You can fill out your forms. That's where we're suggesting everybody go to take the next steps.
Terrific. That's helpful.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. So this is our last one for today. It's from Summer, who says, are they going to run out of money before they get to me? That's it.
I sure hope not. What do you think, Mike?
So the good news is this has already been paid for. Congress spent money to create the public service loan forgiveness program and to make student loans to you. And that was accounted for back when the loans were made. It doesn't require an appropriation from Congress to do this waiver to cancel student debt in this way. And so there's not a risk of running out of money over the course of the next year. There's just a risk of running out of time. So make sure you get your paperwork in.
Really good message. Allie?
That's it for questions. So if you'd like to make some closing comments, Congresswoman.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a wealth of information. We are so pleased to have Mike with us today, Executive Director of the Student Borrower Protection Center, and his knowledge. Thank you, Mike. So please know that I have caseworkers on my team in Oregon who can help you if you're struggling with the Department of Education and PSLF or federal loans. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your public service. I'm going to continue my work on behalf of students and borrowers for these protections and for a lasting solution, not just for the public service loan forgiveness program, but for affordable, accessible higher education. Again, I want to let you know that this webinar has been recorded. We'll email the recording to you, as well as the links to all the very helpful information that we had today. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. We had a tremendous amount of interest today. Just shows how important this issue is. But with the information that we provided and the links you will be receiving, I hope you get your questions answered. If not, please reach out. And thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to Mike Pierce, and stay safe, everyone.